But Proclus talks about daemons, which are not exactly the same thing, but are close enough for our purposes here. And you do have a notion of evil daemons who have become corrupted because of their close proximity to matter, who can then be purified and return to their normal activity. The primary difference on the existence of evil and this part of the divine names seems to be, but I will argue may not actually be eschatological. It happens after death. The late Platonists believe in reincarnation. You died, the gods helped purify you some in between incarnations, and then you came back and you did it again until you purified yourself to a point. In Plotinus, for instance, you no longer had to reincarnate, or in Iamblichus, you become a theurgic sage, and you inhabit your body immaterially, and it doesn't affect you like the gods, basically. And so we've got reincarnation, the ability of any being to remove hylic accretions. This is sort of what happens because of our association with matter, with the hyle. It sticks onto our pneumatic vehicle is the language, and the logi of the gods and the good can't get through, and so we can't participate in the divine, and we become not good, basically. But this can all be gotten rid of through catharsis, ritual catharsis, that sort of theurgy, through sacrifices to the gods, things like that. But it also can happen after death. The gods will purify you. So your state of sin, as it were. And we do see hamartia showing up in the Neoplatonic corpus as an idea of sin. And it goes back to Greek tragedies and things like that, so it's pretty old. This happens both during life and after life. Whereas normally in Christianity you think, well, once you die a sinner, out of luck. Right? So Dionysius appears to limit the ability for catharsis to the single life of any soul. Those who live a life of sin and die that way, no redemption. Sucks to be you. Yeah. And the reason for this has to do with God having given humanity the power to resist evil. And then he says, well, I really explained this in my book called Concerning Just and Divine Chastisement. And we get nothing else. So it becomes one of those questions, does this book actually exist? Does he actually explain this? Or does he stop talking because he's trying to hide something else that's going on? But as I said, this may only be an appearance of difference. The later Neoplatonists that allow for impermanent eschatological punishment. You burn in Hades or Tartarus, it burns off the hylic accretions, and then you reincarnate again. The divine names, while saying there is punishment, does not say for how long. It doesn't say when that punishment occurs. It just says there's punishment. Sort of like I take the sacrament out of the and then I put it back in, right? When does it occur? He never says. If you assume he's a Christian, well then, obviously it happens after death. But if he's not, again, it may not be permanent. We just don't know. So this leads us to the question, of course, what is evil? No one has a good answer yet.
It's not good, though.
It's not good, yeah.
Well, because that's the Augustinian one.
Yeah, right. and that's fairly Platonic. Plotinus is very much like that. We're going to talk about that, actually. He has this whole absolute evil thing, which the other Neoplatonists are like, that's silly. Proclus's lengthy discussion of the subject is basically a refutation of Plotinus. A very lengthy, repetitive, technically languaged refutation of Plotinus' idea of absolute evil. So Proclus and Dionysius agree that evil is a privation of a good. That's sort of the basic definition of evil. The privation of the good or God in some given thing. They both deny the existence of an absolute or primary evil. There's no source. They say that is where all evil comes from. Nothing like that exists. To speak of absolute evil as existing makes no sense, because it's a privation. It's a lack. As a privation, a lacking to some degree, as exhibited by a being going against its proper mode of existence. That is what evil is. We have a way of being, depending on if you are a body or a soul or something above a soul. And if you're not doing that, that's you acting in an evil way. You're not evil. The way that you are acting is contrary to the good. Evil is not in anything but what it lacks. It is, if you would please, thank you, a privation and failure. This is where I said he goes on. A privation and failure and want of strength and want of proportion and want of attainment and want of purpose. And without beauty and without life and without mind and without reason, without completeness and without stability and without cause and without limit and without production. Inactive, all of it. This is evil. It is all the things that you're not supposed to be. Specifically, to a demon, evil is to be contrary to the good like mind. To a soul, to be contrary to reason. To a body, to be contrary to nature. And this has some profound implications of ideas of fate and providence, and is it bad to be an incarnation? And it depends. I would say, well, it depends. Do you as a soul, do you incline towards physicality or towards divinity? The person who inclines towards the divine rational nature rises above fate, because they now have connected themselves to the divine mind, which is above fate, starts happening in the psychic realm, basically. And this goes on to say that fate is identical to providence, depending on from which direction you are looking at. If you are looking from above, you have providence. If you're looking up, why is this crap happening to me? Often it is happening because you, as a body, you are going against nature, which is bound by fate in astrology and the stars, the physical bodies of the gods. Because fate is bound to those physical bodies of the gods in astrology, because the gods are all good in Iamblichus, in Neoplatonism. Ultimately, if there is something going on bad in your life, it's not because of the stars, but because of your lack of proper participation in them. It's all on you, folks, basically. So there's a great deal of responsibility inherent to Neoplatonic thought. And if you identify yourself as your body, you are subject to nature. Completely. If you identify as your soul, your body is still subject to nature, because it's a natural thing. But at that point, as you are no longer identifying as your body, it's not a big deal, but it does not affect you, the essential you, right? The you that Richard Smalley was talking about. Yes.
Is it Cato that says, help me out, Fata volentum nabunt, nolentum trahunt? So fate guides the willing, the unwilling it drags.
That's very apropos of Iamblichus, who uses that, not that language, but that definitely that ideology of the willing submission to divine reality, divine order, frees you.
And then in turn that's Spinoza.
Iamblichus, the most important philosopher you've ever heard of.
There's human.
I was going to pack out more slowly.
Right.
Well, there's so much Platonism in Crowley. Potted Platonism, perhaps. But yeah. I didn't want to say it on camera, but yes.
I just want to make a point, we're running near time.
I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries.
I go on.
But it's a good gun. And it's appropriate since you're dealing with a philosopher who is unafraid of conjunctions that run on.
Yes, yes.
And on and on.
And on and on and on, and without many things. So here is our essence of evil. Iamblichus says that evil lies in us mistaking a good for the good and pursuing it. So money can be good, but love of money is the root of all evil, right? So going after money because we think it is the most important thing, that's where we go wrong. So he writes this: let us then elevate our very selves by our prayers to the higher ascent of the divine and good rays. This is sort of this is what theurgy or hierarchia is about. As if a luminous chain being suspended from the celestial heights comes down to us and we pull ourselves upwards. That's why I put this quotation here. It is unlike many forms of magic where we think about bringing the gods down to us. Theurgy says, Iamblichus explicitly says, when talking about invocation, that it is not in fact the God coming down to us, but us rising to the God. That is how divine possession occurs. We become so much like the God, the difference between us and it vanishes, and the God speaks to us. Don't try this at home. Or maybe you should. So, this single sentence is the explanation of theurgy. Sacred rites, hierarchia, theurgia, whatever you want to call it. It is anagogic. It is to raise us upwards. In Iamblichian doxography, the Dionysius mysteries are types of material theurgy. He has material theurgy, a liminal theurgy, and immaterial theurgy, which he doesn't talk about at all because it's immaterial. Material theurgy is that it would have been sacrifices, prayers, chanting, burning of incense, and things like that. And that is effectively what the Eucharist is. It is a replication of sacrifice, quite explicitly, it seems. And the sacrifice was the primary form of material theurgy for Iamblichus. So they're pretty much the same thing. It is, we're trying to raise up, to engage with as much as possible, which is almost none, the cataphatic God, or the logi, that which we can experience as being God. To achieve this, the theurgic ideology behind the mystery must be seen as practical as well as theoretical. You have to do it. So from this Neoplatonic perspective, the theurgic aspects of the sacred rites are real, and when properly approached, achieve their results. Otherwise, what's the point? To achieve this gem, hierarchia, like theurgy, must be accompanied with proper knowledge of the rites. This is why the hierarch is so important, because the hierarch is the only individual who knows all the stuff. Each ritual, as I said, we see this in the ecclesiastical hierarchy, where it's explained 3 times in 3 different ways. That each time Dionysius is like, and don't let the profane know this. And there are times where like, well, I can't explain this any further because it would be inappropriate, it's too high of a mystery. Which suggests Dionysius is not writing as a hierarch. And some have assumed or thought that if he was a real person, he was a monk, the highest level of the sacred people, but not clergy properly. Now, this knowledge, while really, really important, right, it is ultimately reserved for the priesthood, especially the hierarchs who perform the most important rites, especially the consecration of the holy oil, which only the hierarch is capable of doing, which is then used in everything else, basically. And basically acts as a monad for the priests and the deacons. The hierarch, the bishop, is the summation, which in everything below sort of gets summed into and is one of. Without a hierarch, none of the sacred rites are possible. from the first sacred rite individual experience would be illumination, baptism, divine birth. The sanctified begins the spiritual ascent towards the divine through participation of those rites. It is not, however, entirely through their power the knowledge occurs. The power to resist evil comes from God and is transmitted through the angelic hierarchy to the hierarch, who through intellectual and Gnostic knowledge, as it were, what they call intuitive knowing in Amicus, using the word gnosis, transmits to the rest of the clergy and the ranks of the initiated, those three ranks in the middle, the power of the sacred mysteries. So again, we've got Proclus' theology: remaining, proceeding, reverting. The purpose of the sacred rites is to revert those who participate them back to their divine source. This is what happens. This is what is the purpose of taking communion, in that literal sense. Not just the community of the people, but that communion, that union with Christ. So it becomes a type of theosis. The power of divine eros, which is the language Dionysius specifically uses over agape, as manifested in the mysteries and those consecrated to perform them, calls us back to God. Dionysius talks about three forms of eros. There is the eros of God for us, the eros of us for God, and the eros of the Trinity that is equal, where the other two are unequal. Through the ecstasy of the divine rites and the eros they inspire in us, through and in which, like St. Paul, Christ lives. That is what the purpose is. But only if you are participating in them correctly, which can only happen if you have correct knowledge of them. And why we do not change our ontological level through engaging in these rites. We more fully claim our place in the divine chain through them, becoming like God so far as possible. That is all I have.
You cannot explain any more.
Well, you see, in the beginning was the Word. Oh, wait, that's yours. Ben?
So do you suppose that, like, if the Amicus were transported through time, like smack into, just hypothetically, Martinus Lodge, that, like, we might get some sense of what was being attempted?
If you could translate the language and culture, and given the absolute nothing I know about Martinism, sure.
Well, just given that you got these people in this room with all these candles and these symbols that are obviously...
I think it would look a lot like sacrifice. That's something that he would be familiar with.
Right, so you at least get some idea before...
Yeah, I mean, I think the Eucharist would as well. If you explain to him what it was, the idea of God being this physical thing, but not being the physical thing. Oh yeah, I said that. Yeah, I don't think that would be anything surprising to him. He would say, well, you should be killing something.
Been there, done that.
Yeah.
Could you do the whole thing again?
In the late 6th century, that's how I start everything with Dionysius, because you see all the things. So I believe we should perpetuate this.
What's your scholarly opinion or your gut feeling if he is a crypto-pagan, just the name of my dubstep band, or
that's a great debate.
Or if he is a canonical?
Until I read this paper, I assumed, like everybody else, that he was a Christian. But and there are two reasons why we seem to make that assumption. One, because he says so, but he also says he's Dionysius the Areopagite. So. You see my point there, right? And then you have, like, every scholar who wants him to be a Christian says, well, no pagan could write something like this. To which I say, well, why? Given me enough time, I could write something like this. He has a scattering of biblical quotes. And almost, to me, everything else is Platonist, couched in Christian terms. So it could really go, what clinched it for me was that what he copies most heavily is Proclus's Platonic theology, which at this time was not in circulation. You had to be, from what I understand, had to be part of Damascus's inner circle to have access to it. And Damascus hated Christians. Like, wrote an entire treatise against the Christians, much like Proclus did, much like Julian the philosopher. So I refuse to call him the apostate. I'm only going to call him the apostate if I get to call Paul the apostate as well. So while it is theoretically possible, I mean, you could still do it, I suppose.
Well, what if it was more than, I mean, it seems more likely that, you know, how they conflate two women that are 100 years apart in Rome. You can easily conflate two people, a Christian by the same name even possibly, picks it up and says, oh, this is how I'm going to answer my Sunday school questions.
Yeah, and it's because of that ambiguity that I'm not absolutely convinced, but I definitely entertain it as a realistic possibility. But I don't have, as much as I like the idea that it is a really intriguing idea for this pagan to have influenced Christianity to such a huge extent, writing as a pagan, I don't know that's what actually happened. It's just really interesting to me.
And to me, it sounds much more like a proto-Orthodox Christian. And so much of the language, because it shares a common source, is the language of Orthodoxy. That's why I think that possibly the Peter the Iberian thesis may have hold some water.
I forget the name of who but it's been put forth that it might have been a monophysite from Gregory Circle.
Gregory Nissus.
Yeah, but not necessarily himself. But there have been lots of guesses. One of the first academic that I know to talk about him being a pagan. So, well, it was probably Damascus.
That's what I've heard.
Though if
That's
he did,
out of character.
because Damascus writes like Damascus and changes a lot of Proclus, and you see none of the Damascian theology in here. You just see Proclus.
Yeah.
But it could certainly be someone from Damascus school who had access to Proclus. It's impossible to know, I think. So I can't say one way or the other.
You can.
Well, I can.
And it was me, because that's how we make our academic reputations.
Yes.
By unsubstantiated claims.
But I'm not trying to get
Brilliant
to
academic.
Sorry?
I must be a brilliant academic.
Just make wild, unsubstantiated
Yeah, you
claims
missed
all the time.
you missed our discussion before lunch.
Yeah. In which he
But to answer your question, I really just don't know.
I know.
I don't have a feeling one way or the other, really. Anything else?
Which is his nice way of saying he's a pagan.
Do you usually provide that?
What do you know about the Sabaean school of Haran?
Relatively little. Something of it. There is a thought that Simplicus, I think, when the academy was closed, a bunch of the Neoplatonists went to Haran, and you find a lot of Neoplatonism and the Haranian Hermetism from there, and were protected by the various its other figures. I don't know if that. I know that's an idea. I don't know if anyone's put forth evidence, hard evidence, to suggest it. So, but that's about what I know about Sabians. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
As always, how will I ever fill 2 hours?